house had stood for over a century, its foundation sinking into the damp earth like a forgotten relic. The paint had long since peeled away, exposing the rotting wood beneath. Ivy strangled the outer walls, its tendrils creeping across shattered windows like fingers searching for something unseen. Inside, dust thickened the air, disturbed only by the occasional gust of wind through unseen cracks. It was an ordinary house in every sense, except for the footsteps. Every night, without fail, they echoed from the attic, a slow, deliberate pacing, sometimes soft, as if bare feet dragged across the wooden boards, other times sharp, like boots clicking against the floor. They never came during the day. Only after sunset, when darkness swallowed the world, did they begin. Thomas Miller had inherited the house from his uncle, an estranged relative whose name he barely remembered. The will had been clear. The house is yours now. Do not disturb what sleeps within. At first, he ignored the strange sounds. It was an old house. Old houses creaked, but creaking was different from footsteps. The rhythm was unmistakable, the weight behind them undeniable. Someone or something walked in the attic each night. Some nights, Thomas would lie awake in bed, frozen beneath the covers, ears straining to catch every step. Other nights, he would sit in his living room, staring at the ceiling as the sound drifted down like a ghostly heartbeat. Then, one evening, something changed. The footsteps paused. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. And then, 3 loud knocks. Not from the attic, from the door. When Thomas opened it, the porch was empty. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a whisper, a sigh, a name he could not make out. He stepped back inside, locked the door, and told himself it was nothing. But that night, the footsteps were louder. They were getting closer. Thomas had never been one to believe in ghosts. The stories people told about haunted houses and restless spirits always seemed like nonsense, the kind of thing meant to frighten children or sell horror movies. But this house, his house, was different. The footsteps were real. The weight of them, the deliberate pacing, the sense of something just beyond sight. He could not explain it away. For weeks he tried to ignore them. He convinced himself it was nothing more than the house settling, the wind shifting through unseen cracks. But the sounds never stopped. In fact, they grew bolder. At first, the footsteps were confined to the attic, but soon, Thomas started hearing them in the hallways. The creak of floorboards just outside his bedroom. The slow, deliberate sound of someone moving through the house when he was completely alone. Then came the dreams. They started subtly, shadows stretching unnaturally, shapes shifting in the corners of his vision. Then, the dreams grew darker. He saw the attic door swinging open on its own, a yawning blackness beyond it. Something waited in that darkness, watching him with unseeing eyes. He would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced that if he looked toward the ceiling, he would see something peering down at him through the cracks. By the time the knocking returned, Thomas had made his decision. He would go into the attic. It was just past midnight when he stood at the foot of the attic ladder, flashlight in one hand, breath held tight in his chest. The wooden hatch loomed above him, its edges coated in dust and cobwebs. He had never opened it before. The idea of climbing into the unknown space had always felt wrong, like stepping over an invisible threshold he was never meant to cross. But the footsteps had left him no choice. With a deep breath, he reached up and pulled the hatch open. The smell hit him immediately. Stale air, old wood, something else he couldn't quite place, the kind of scent that belonged to places forgotten by time. Dust rained down as the hatch creaked, exposing a square of suffocating darkness. He hesitated. Then, gripping the sides of the ladder, he climbed. The attic was empty. His flashlight beam cut through the dust-heavy air, revealing nothing but wooden beams, insulation, and discarded furniture draped in white sheets. A few scattered boxes lined the edges of the room, untouched for years. The floor was thick with dust, undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of anyone, living or otherwise. Thomas felt his stomach sink. The footsteps were real. He knew they were real, but there was nothing here. No proof, no explanation. Had he imagined everything? A cold gust brushed against his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. He swung the flashlight wildly, its beam casting long shadows that stretched and twisted along the attic walls. Nothing moved. He stood there for several moments, listening, waiting. The silence pressed down on him, thick and heavy. He wanted something to happen, anything, just to prove he wasn't losing his mind. But the attic remained still, the dust undisturbed. Defeated, he sighed and lowered the flashlight. Maybe it really was the house settling. Maybe the stress of living alone in this decrepit place had started playing tricks on him. He turned back toward the ladder and froze. Something was wrong. The hatch was open. He had climbed up through it, but now, staring down at it, he realized that the darkness below was too deep, as if the ladder no longer led down into his home, but somewhere else entirely. He swallowed hard. He had to get out of here. Now, shaking off the unease, he descended the ladder quickly, his boots echoing in the silence. He shut the attic hatch firmly behind him and locked it. That night he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting, listening. For the first time in weeks, there were no footsteps. He should have felt relief, but the silence was worse. Morning came like a fevered dream, the light outside cold and gray. Thomas tried to shake off the strange weight in his chest as he went through his routine. Coffee, a quick glance at his unread emails. Anything to ground himself in normalcy. But something felt different. Office. The house was too still. He told himself it was just the lack of sleep, the stress. But deep down, something gnawed at him. A thought he couldn't shake. What if whatever was in the attic had never been in the attic at all? What if it had always been somewhere else? And now, it was closer. He tried to ignore the idea. He distracted himself with errands, leaving the house for most of the day. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, dread curled in his stomach. He didn't want to go back, but he had no choice. As he stepped through the front door, the silence of the house swallowed him whole. The air was thick, heavy, wrong. He double-checked the attic hatch, still locked. He forced himself to eat dinner, watched TV with the volume too high, told himself he was being ridiculous. But the moment he lay down in bed, he felt it, the presence, like unseen eyes watching from the darkness. He squeezed his eyes shut, willed sleep to come. Then, a single creak, not from the attic, from inside the room. His heart seized. He barely dared to breathe. Another step, closer. The floor groaned beneath an unseen weight. He could feel it now. Something was right behind him. The air in the room thickened, pressing against Thomas like a suffocating weight. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, each pulse echoing through his skull. He lay still, his body paralyzed beneath the covers, every nerve screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. He wouldn't turn around. The floorboards groaned again. Another step, It was close now, right behind him. A chill rolled down his spine, sinking deep into his bones. The air smelled different, stale, damp, with the faintest trace of something rotting. He could hear breathing, not his own, something slow, uneven, rasping like lungs filled with dust. The weight of its presence was unbearable. It was real. He hadn't imagined the footsteps. He hadn't imagined the dreams. It had never been in the attic. It had been waiting. And now, it had come down. A whisper brushed against his ear. A sound so soft, so close, he felt the dampness of breath against his skin. His fingers curled into the sheets, his body screaming for movement, for escape. He clenched his teeth. If he turned around, if he saw it, he knew there would be no coming back from that. He squeezed his eyes shut. The bed dipped. Something was leaning over him. He could feel the pressure, the shift in weight as it lowered itself closer. The whispering grew louder, a language he didn't understand, a collection of sounds too ancient, too wrong. Then, the covers started to pull away. Number Thomas clenched his fists, trying to hold on to them, but his body wouldn't obey. His limbs were lead, his breath shallow and ragged. The sheets slid down his shoulder, exposing his skin to the icy air. A hand brushed against him, a hand that felt wrong, too long, too thin. The fingers lingered, pressing against his skin, not with the warmth of life, but with the cold stillness of something that had never been alive. The whispering stopped. Silence. And then, a voice, low, ancient, crawling beneath his skin like spiders. You looked. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled. I didn't look. But the thing behind him knew, and it was pleased. The room twisted. The air vibrated. The darkness behind him stretched, swallowing the walls, the floor, the very reality around him. His body lifted, his limbs flailing. But there was no ground, no ceiling, just the void. And then the world snapped. Morning came, as it always did. Light spilled through the old dust-covered windows, cutting long beams across the wooden floor. The house sat in silence, undisturbed, empty. The attic hatch remained locked, the furniture unmoved. The kitchen chair, once pulled out from the table, stood perfectly in place. But Thomas was gone. Not a single trace of him remained. No scattered belongings, no note, not even an indent in the mattress where he had slept. The house simply absorbed him, as though he had never existed at all. The footsteps, however, returned. That night as the sky darkened and the wind howled through the trees, they began again, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. But they no longer came from the attic. They echoed from the hallway, and sometimes, just sometimes, if someone stood outside the house and listened closely, they would hear something else, breathing, just behind them.